If the year 1763 was a door swinging shut on the First British Empire, then August was the rusted hinge upon which the entire structure groaned and nearly sheared off. As the sun rose on the first day of August, the British presence in the American West hung by a thread. The previous 3 months had been a catalog of disasters. The great forts of the Great Lakes had burned. The garrisons of the Ohio Valley had been butchered or taken captive. The vast territory won from France was now controlled almost entirely by Pontiac's confederation. Only 2 significant British outposts remained. There was Detroit, which was under siege and reeling from the catastrophe of Bloody Run, and there was Fort Pitt, rotting from the inside with smallpox and starvation. Between the safety of the eastern settlements and these isolated islands of British power lay 200 miles of the dark and bloody ground. Forests teeming with Delaware, Shawnee, and Huron warriors who had never been defeated in open battle. August 1763 was the month of the reckoning. It was the month where the fate of the American frontier was decided not by treaties or trade, but by the cold logic of the bayonet. It marks the moment of the Battle of Bushy Run, arguably the most decisive and desperate battle ever fought between the British Army and Native Americans. To the colonists on the coast, August was a month of breathless waiting. They knew that Colonel Henry Bouquet had marched into the woods. They knew that the odds were massively against him. They remembered General Braddock's destruction on the same road 8 years earlier. If Bouquet failed, the frontier would collapse all the way to Philadelphia. And if he succeeded, the empire would hold. August 1763 was a month of sweltering and desperate marches, tactical brilliance, and the grim realization that the price of empire is eternal war. The first week of August brought the march into the fire. See, here was the column. Colonel Henry Bouquet's relief column was a study in desperation. As it trudged west from Fort Bedford in the opening days of August, it looked less like an army and more like a traveling hospital. First, there was the composition. Bouquet had about 460 men. Most were Highlanders from the 42nd, the Black Watch, and the 77th Regiments. These men were shattered. They just returned from the tropical hell of the siege of Havana. They were racked with malaria and dysentery. Some were so weak that they had to be carried along in wagons. But here was the burden. They were not just marching to fight. They were marching to feed. The column was weighed down by 340 pack horses carrying flour and beef for the starving garrison at Fort Pitt. This made them slow, loud, and vulnerable. They were also marching under the shadow of Braddock. You see, every step that Bouquet took was haunted by history. He was marching along Forbes Road, which largely paralleled the route where General Edward Braddock had been annihilated in 1755. You see, here was the fear. The soldiers knew the story. Braddock had been destroyed because he marched in long, thin lines that were easily flanked by Indians moving through the trees. But here was the innovation. Bouquet was a student of forest warfare. He had drilled his Highlanders in a new way of fighting. He taught them to form open order, to rush the enemy rather than stand and fire, and most importantly, to maintain a perimeter around the convoy. He knew the attack was coming. The only question was where and when. But for a long time, this just led to the silence. For the first 4 days of August, the woods were terrifyingly quiet. The scouts reported fresh tracks. They found abandoned farmhouses with meals left half-eaten on the tables. They found the charred remains of tortured settlers tied to trees. But they saw no warriors. The Delaware and Shawnee leaders, Gayasuda and Kikiaskung, were watching. They had lifted the siege of Fort Pitt specifically to intercept Bouquet. They chose their ground carefully, a dense, confusing tangle of ravines and hills near a stream called Bushy Run. So yes, the turning point was the Battle of Bushy Run, which was ultimately an ambush on August 5th. In the sweltering afternoon, just 1 mile short of the Bushy Run station, where they hoped to find water, the hammer fell. Here was the attack. The vanguard was hit with a withering fire from the invisible enemy. As Bouquet rushed reinforcements forward, the firing erupted on the flanks, then the rear. The column was surrounded, leading to ultimately this crisis. This was exactly what happened to Braddock. The Indians, using the cover of trees and ravines, poured fire into the huddled mass of redcoats and pack horses. The British were pinned down on a hilltop. They could not advance, and they could not retreat. This ultimately led to the Flour Bag Fort. As night fell, the situation was dire. Dozens of men were dead or screaming in agony. There was no water. The August heat was brutal. Bouquet ordered the flour sacks taken off the pack horses and stacked in a circle on top of the hill to protect the wounded. Inside this flour bag fort, the thirst-crazed soldiers listened to the taunts of the warriors in the darkness. "We will scalp you in the morning. No one will escape." That night, Bouquet wrote a letter to General Amherst, fully expecting it to be his last. He described the disaster calmly, noting the dreadful situation of the wounded. But alas, there was a masterstroke on August 6th. The next morning brought a renewed assault. The Indians, sensing victory, pressed closer, preparing for the final rush to wipe out the exhausted British. But there was a trap. Bouquet realized that static defense meant death. He needed to make the enemy expose themselves. He ordered 2 companies of Highlanders to withdraw from the front line, feigning a retreat. That retreat was ultimately the bait, and the warriors took it. Believing that the British line was breaking, they broke cover and charged into the gap, screaming for blood. And this is what sprung the hammer. It was exactly what Bouquet was waiting for. The retreating companies had actually circled around behind a small hill. As the Indians rushed into the gap, the Highlanders smashed into their flank, delivering a devastating volley and then charging with bayonets. And that's what ultimately led to the rout. The shock was total. The warriors, caught in the open and flanked, panicked. The British pursued them through the woods, turning the ambush into a rout. 2 prominent chiefs were killed, including possibly Kikioskung's son, and the native force was shattered and fled. Here was the significance of this victory. The Battle of Bushy Run is the forgotten turning point of colonial history. If Bouquet had lost, Fort Pitt would have fallen. The British frontier would have collapsed to the Susquehanna River. The psychological blow might have forced Britain to abandon the West entirely. But by winning, Bouquet proved that the British army could fight in the woods. He broke the myth of native invincibility that had persisted since 1755. So in the second week of August, we saw the relief of Fort Pitt. First, there was the arrival on August 10th. After 4 more days of cautious marching, Bouquet's battered column crested the final ridge and saw the forks of the Ohio River. Here was the sight. Fort Pitt was still there, and the Union Jack was still flying, which of course led to the rescue. The scene inside the fort was grim. The 600 inhabitants were gaunt, pale, and traumatized. They'd been sealed inside for 2 months. The arrival of the Highlanders carrying the flour bags that had saved their lives at Bushy Run was greeted with weeping and prayers. And ultimately, this was, for Fort Pitt, the end of the siege. The victory at Bushy Run had scattered the besieging tribes. The guns fell silent. The road to the east was open, though still very dangerous. And the key to the west was secure. And from there, the news spread. It took weeks for the news of Bushy Run to reach the coast, but in Philadelphia, when the first express riders arrived in mid-August with Bouquet's letters, the city exhaled. The Pennsylvania Gazette published the accounts, and for the first time in months, the tone shifted from panic to pride. The Black Watch became the heroes of the hour. When the news eventually reached London months later, it vindicated the decision to keep a standing army. It proved that regulars were necessary to hold the continent. But there was still a stalemate and a long wait in Detroit. While Bouquet was winning in Pennsylvania, the war in Michigan settled into a grim stalemate. This was, of course, in the aftermath of Bloody Run. At Detroit, the British garrison was still reeling from the disaster of July 31st, known as Bloody Run. In that environment, the siege continued. Pontiac kept the pressure on. Though he could not storm the walls, he kept the garrison pinned down. This eventually spawned a schooner war. See, August saw a series of naval skirmishes on the Detroit River. The British schooners, Huron and Michigan, were critical. They were the only way to get supplies from Niagara. Pontiac's warriors tried repeatedly to board them at night or burn them with fire rafts. And then there was the incident of the Huron. In late August, the schooner Huron was attacked by canoes. The crew of only 10 men fought off dozens of warriors in a desperate hand-to-hand battle on the deck. The captain was killed, but the crew held the ship. This naval dominance saved Detroit from starvation. And finally, there was a crack in the alliance. By late August, cracks began to appear in Pontiac's coalition. First, there was the French lie. Pontiac had promised his warriors that the French king was waking up and sending an army to help them. But as August dragged on and no French fleet appeared up the Mississippi, the warriors began to doubt. And then there was the harvest. You see, August is harvest time. The warriors were citizen soldiers. They needed to hunt and gather food for their families for the winter. The long siege was draining their resources. Some tribes began to drift away, making separate peace overtures to Major Gladwin. And then there was the paper war in London with the proclamation. While bayonets decided the issue in America, pens were busy in London. August 1763 was a critical month for the drafting of the Proclamation of 1763. See, first there was the news arriving from May. By August, the British ministry had received the full reports of the initial May uprisings, and they were horrified. This was immediately a confirmation. The war confirmed everything that the Board of Trade feared. The laissez-faire settlement policy had caused a bloodbath, which ultimately led them to take or create a hard line. The Earl of Shelburne and his clerks worked through the August heat to finalize the new boundary line, and the news of the massacres only hardened their resolve. There would be no nuance. The Appalachian Mountains would be a hard wall, no settlement west of the line, period. There was also a financial crisis to deal with. August 1763 saw the deepening of the fiscal crisis that would lead, ultimately, to the Stamp Act. First, there was the cost of war. Every day the army spent fighting Pontiac cost a fortune. The mules, the flour, the gunpowder, it all had to be shipped across the Atlantic or bought at inflated colonial prices. And then there was the simple logic of taxation. See, George Grenville watched the expenses mount. The victory at Bushy Run was great news, but it was also expensive news. It solidified his belief that the Americans are the ones benefiting from this protection, so the Americans must pay the bill. And finally, let's look at the texture of life in August of 1763. First, there was the Paxton Rage in the Pennsylvania backcountry, and the relief of Fort Pitt did not end that anger. There were the atrocities. Throughout August, small raiding parties slipped past the forts and struck isolated farms. The brutality was extreme: scalping, dismemberment, burning. This ultimately created a sense of radicalization. The Scots-Irish settlers of Paxton and Donegal townships felt a seething hatred, not just for the Indians, but for the friendly Christianized Indians living in the eastern settlements. They began to embrace a theory of racial extermination. All Indians are enemies. And this toxic atmosphere was brewing the violence that would explode a few months later in December. There was also the urban depression. In Boston and New York, the news of the frontier war killed commerce. The trade froze. No fur was coming out of the interior. No British goods were going in. The merchant houses, already overextended, began to fail. And then there was the unemployment. Sailors, dock workers, and teamsters were out of work. The mobs of Boston were growing larger and more restless. The economic pain of August 1763 was the soil in which the seeds of the liberty movement would soon be planted. And then there was the seemingly endless smallpox scourge. The epidemic in the South continued to burn through August, and that had, of course, a massive impact on the slave trade. In Charleston, the slave trade was paralyzed. Ships were quarantined. The deaths of enslaved people represented a massive loss of capital for the planter class, adding to the economic anxiety. As August 31st, 1763 faded into September, the British Empire in America had stepped back from the precipice. Thanks to the tactical genius of Henry Bouquet and the discipline of the Black Watch, the line had held. Fort Pitt was saved. The key to the West remained in British hands. The myth of the unstoppable Indian uprising was broken. But this victory came at a terrible cost. First, there was the psychological cost. The colonists realized that their safety depended entirely on the British regular army. They could not defend themselves. This created a complex neurosis. They needed the redcoats, but they resented the soldiers' presence and the taxes required to pay for them. There was also the political cost. The violence of August guaranteed that the proclamation of 1763 would be strictly enforced. The British government would now treat the colonists like unruly children who couldn't be trusted with the frontier. And there was also, sadly, a racial cost. The atrocities of the summer of 1763 hardened the racial lines of America. The middle ground was gone. For the next century, the story of the West would be one of removal and extermination, not coexistence. August 1763 was also the high watermark of Pontiac's war. He had pushed the empire to the brink, but at Bushy Run, the empire pushed back. The war would drag on for another 2 years, but the chance to drive the British into the sea had already passed. The Americans and the British were in the West to stay, and soon they would turn on each other.